Last year, I picked up 3 Seiko 5s with the newer 4R series movement that adds hacking and hand winding, something that is desperately missing from most of the lower end Seikos. Now, I already covered 2 of those, starting in last September with the strangely appealing bottle cap, and in November I followed that up with the abominable ice monster. And here we are with the last of that trio, the SRPB89, and as far as I know, it doesn't have a nickname. I've just been calling it the Big Blue Seiko 5. Now, like those other 2, this isn't a real diver, more of a dive style watch. But unlike the others, this has the look of a contemporary diver. So let's start things off by taking a look at the dimensions, as this is a little on the larger side. It's listed as 43 millimeters wide, and I found it just a little over that at 43.3 without the crown. Width is closer to 46.3. Meanwhile, lug to lug is 49.5, and I think it's about 12.5 millimeters tall. For comparison, it's just a hair smaller than the ice monster in width, length, and height. Lug width is 22 millimeters, so it's standard for a diver, yet it only has 100 meters of water resistance, which is one of the reasons I refer to this as a dive style watch rather than a real diver. The other is that it lacks a screw-down crown. Weight is 163 grams with its bracelet, and the price should be around 150 to 170, depending on where you look. As you would expect, the case is stainless and has a mix of brushed and polished surfaces. The top is brushed, while the sides and the back are polished. The case is rather minimal, with your eyes drawn towards the bezel and the dial. In fact, the case might be a little boring, especially with the lack of any crown guards. Although looking at the side, you can see that the lugs aren't very long, but they do slope down nicely, giving it a sleek look. There are 2 things I like here. The first is that you can see between the lugs a small little section of the case that rises from the bracelet and the end links. It's polished, so it stands out from the brushed finishing. It's not much, but I think it gives the case just a little bit of character. The other thing is that the lugs are drilled, which is always nice, and a nice little surprise on a Seiko 5. A typical screw-down exhibition caseback adorns the rear, where you can see the Seiko's 4R35B movement. Back to the front, the bezel is a 120 unidirectional click, and has a little bit of an aggressive edge to it. It gives it a nice grip, which makes it easy to turn. The bezel has a nice click as you turn it, but there's also a little bit of play to it. Unfortunately, the numbers on the insert aren't loomed, but that insert is a nice blue that matches the dial, although it's more of a matte finish than the sunburst on the dial. As you would expect at a Seiko of this price, the crystal is hardlicks, but underneath that crystal is a beautiful blue sunburst dial. It's so good that I don't think I've gotten a bad picture of it. And it really is this wonderful deep blue color. It's very reminiscent of what I saw on the Orient Mako 2, although comparing this to the Ray 2 would be better, as the dial layout is a bit Submariner-like. Although here with some slightly different proportions. The dot seems smaller and maybe further apart, especially when you look at the deep ocean of blue that sits between them. Those hour indicators are nicely done. They're applied with just a thin framing of silver. And just beyond them is the chapter ring, which is a silver band that goes around the dial and seems to sit on top of it. There's a circular etching that goes around it, and when you combine that with the matte blue bezel, it creates a very nice framing effect for the dial. Although in some ways, depending on the angle you look at it, the gap between the dial and the indices does look maybe a little too large. Perhaps it would help if the hands were just a little bit longer to compensate. It just looks like perhaps the case is a little bigger than it's supposed to be. Speaking of the hands, they are silver and partially skeletonized. And other than being a little short, they look very well done. The second hand, however, is just this thin metallic stick, which depending on the angle or the light you're looking at it, may get lost in that dial. Perhaps if it was a different shape or some other color, it would benefit the design. Although at that point, it might look a little bit too much like the Mako or Rays. There's also a small date at the 3, but no day, which is a little different for a Seiko 5. Overall, the dial is very well done, And except for the second hand, everything has a nice contrast. The white against that deep blue just really pops. Now, as I said earlier, the movement is a 4R35B, so 40 hours of power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. Accuracy on this one was okay, sitting about plus 15 a day. I would prefer a little better, but that's all within specs for Seiko. Plus, it should be easy to regulate later. Now, it's not really a Seiko unless it has some really great loom, and this does not disappoint. And I really like the look of the hour hand here, sort of this double arrow. For comparison, I threw it up against its sibling, the Ice Monster, as well as the Orient Kamasu, plus my new Airman, just because I was curious how it would fare. After 40 minutes, it's actually the weakest of those four, but not by much, and everything is still visible. So overall, it's still pretty good. Bracelet is okay, and what you would expect on a sub $200 Seiko. It's brushed with a bit of polish on the center links. The finish of the bracelet is okay, as well as the clasp. It is signed. It has folded end links like you'd expect, but the rest of it is solid. Has a nice good weight and feel to it, but it does rattle a little. It'll do just fine for a while, but with those drilled lugs, it's easy to swap it out just to change up the look, or to see if you prefer a NATO. And I should mention that unlike the Ice Monster, there's much more clearance between the case and the spring bars, so you won't need curved spring bars to take advantage of a NATO. Either way, the watch wears quite well for its size. The lugs curve down nicely to help it just hug your wrist. And that massive blue dial just pops, giving it some fantastic wrist presence. Now, unlike a turtle, which wears smaller than it actually is, this wears like it should. It still feels a little large, but should be manageable. Even though the Ice Monster is similar in size, this one wears better, which I think is all thanks to those lowered curved lugs, compared to the Ice Monster's flatter case shape. That said, I still prefer the Ice Monster. It's not for everyone, but that case and dial just give it a real distinct personality. Just as it was with the other Seiko 5s, this watch does bring up the question of which is better. Buying a dive-style watch with 100 meters of water resistance, yet with an upgraded movement, or a Seiko SKX for about the same price, where you would have a 200-meter diver, yet with an older, non-hackable, non-hand-windable movement. And just as before, it's really going to come down to your own needs, on if you value a tougher watch over a more convenient experience. Personally, I'd go with the Seiko 5. There's much more of a variety in looks, and in reality, 100 meters of water resistance is perfectly fine for a daily desk diver. To sum it up, this is a fantastic looking Seiko 5, with fit, finish, and quality you would expect from a Seiko at this price, albeit in a slightly larger package. So if you're wanting a larger watch with a fantastic sunburst blue dial, this one could have your name on it. Although if you aren't looking for a larger watch, well, at that point, I can't help but think that you should take a look at the Orient Ray 2, which is a similar fantastic dial in a slightly more manageable package. Not to mention, it has a screw-down crown and 200 meters of water resistance, so it is a real diver. Plus, it usually can be found for the exact same price. For myself, I only have room for one Seiko 5 dive style watch, and that is the Seiko Ice Monster. It's not for everyone, but I still love the look. My only long-term concern is that it always feels a little too tall on a NATO. So for now, I'm planning on keeping it, at least until I get a real monster. In the meantime, let me know in the comments what you think about this Seiko 5. Is it just the right size, or would you rather get the Orient? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.